You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Welcome back to Music Tectonics, where we go beneath the surface of music in tech. I'm your host, Dmitri. Well, actually, I'm not your host. Today, we have an interview with Tristra New Year Yeager, chief writer and strategist at Rock, Paper, Scissors, with Dr. Christopher White, the author of The AI Music Problem. They get into a really interesting question. Is AI redefining music, or is music reshaping AI? It's a great conversation about the future of music creation. But first, the news.
Rock, paper, scanner.
Haha, we're back with the Rock, Paper, Scanner News Roundup with one of my favorite people in the world, our chief writer and strategist, Tristra New Year Yeager.
Hello. I missed you, Dmitri. I missed rounding up the news. I mean, the news has been scattered all over the place without these roundups. It's been a tough summer. I don't know if everyone listening felt that.
Nobody's even read the news while we were gone on little summer breaks and such, but we're back. I'm excited. We have a bunch of articles to talk about. I want to dive in. Richard Smirk over at Billboard wrote an article, The Largest IP Theft in Human History, breaking down the years-long investigation into how AI firms are stealing music. Global music publishers group ICMP says songs by the Beatles and Michael Jackson are among those being illegally scraped to train Gen AI systems by the likes of Meta, OpenAI, X, and Microsoft. Tristra, I just had to bring this one up.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've seen somebody list out all of the platforms and all of the perceived or posited scraping that they've done. There's a bullet list in here that's maybe 10 bullets long of every single Copilot, OpenAI, DeepSeek, what each of them are thought to have done. And the ICMPs just sort of putting it out there hey, this has all been scraped. And really and even mentioning these fair use lawsuits, that fair use actually is more of a European policy than an American one, and even goes in to point out double standards that the tech companies have, that their terms and conditions say, hey, you can't use our material. You can't use any of this user-generated content that's on our platforms. Mm-hmm. But here we are saying, well, it's fair use for us to use everything else in the world.
It's funny how fair use is kind of like what works for me sometimes in the minds of certain companies, it seems.
Seems fair to me. And then just jumping into another one, The Conversation had an article called What is AI Slop? A technologist explains this new and largely unwelcome form of online content. We don't have to go into detail. It just was a pinpoint of saying there's tons of YouTube AI content that would fall under this category of people are just posting tons and tons of AI generated content.
And a lot of it is drowning out legitimate creators who spend lots of time and effort and care in creating their content. So for instance, I saw a great article in 404 Media about history channels, and there's AI history slop that is inaccurate, completely bonkers, but it's just by sheer volume is tricking the algorithm into sending people its way instead of to actual historians' content.
Oddly enough, I am not seeing that much AI slop in my feeds. I don't know if I've well-trained my feeds or maybe I'm seeing it and I'm just ignoring it. I don't really know.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think maybe you have that magical crazy pants touch. So
maybe the stuff that I'm seeing is weird enough that they don't care to give me the AI
no
slops.
one's AI slopping it yet. Just wait.
So one more article on this category, and then I'd love to see what you're checking out, Tristra. From Engadget, Chinese social media platforms roll out labels for AI-generated material. WeChat, Douyin, and Weibo are among those deploying label requirements to comply with a new law. So interestingly, we think the Chinese tech is the Wild West in some ways because we think of that way with TikTok in America. But and it's really interesting to see that they're jumping on this so that people can actually tell, at least in theory, people can actually tell what's AI and what's not. And then there's even systems where users can tag things that they think are AI as well. I don't know how much it'll help, whether there's going to be so much AI slop that'll be impossible to tell. Some people in the music industry I've heard say the AI stuff should go on a separate platform of the human one. So if you want to, that would be a great way to tell, right? Is if you knew you were on AI music streaming service, you get one thing. If you're on human music streaming service, you get another. That'd be pretty cool too. But good to see that people are at least attempting to think about how do we address this? How do we filter this as humans?
And I think here, the AI slop is actually a great segue into some of the articles I found really interesting from recent days. Namely, I'm thinking a lot about how streaming services like YouTube and Spotify are no longer just music streaming services. This is not even related to the video component that YouTube's always had and that Spotify has really leaned into a little bit in the past year and a half or so. But it's also add-ons like Spotify just recently announced, and I'm going to use Music Ally's header because it's great. Spotify's ticketing partnerships have escalated quite quickly, and that's in quotes, in 2025. And I've seen this too, and Spotify is kind of spamming me with like, go see Blue Oyster Cult or something like that. I don't know why they've chosen me for Blue Oyster Cult, but very strange. Thank you, Algo. But Bandsintown recently had an integration with YouTube, and there's all these little additions to the streaming service model that seem to be pointing towards really different experiences for music lovers and going beyond. This isn't, I don't think, just the superfan thing. I also think it's a moat against AI slop. So because
you mean because it's real life experience stuff like ticketing?
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just a bunch of content. It's content that's connected to humans, the real world. And that's kind of interesting.
That's super cool. I've always thought there should be more of that kind of like fan engagement, lead to real life events, merch, all that kind of stuff in Spotify. And if you've been on Spotify from the beginning, you've seen lots of attempts and evolutions. And a lot of things have been tried and then pulled back. I'll be curious to see if this one sticks around, because I do think it would be super cool if we had a music operating system kind of feel where you're like going to listen. It's actually not always easy to find concerts in your town. So if it's right in your listening app, they already know what you want to go see. That's a great experience. What else you got?
Well, I'm really intrigued I'm interested in EU law because I'm trying to parse out what exactly is going on with this pause that EU authorities have put on the probe into Universal Music's acquisition of Downtown, which has been a slow simmering story, very, very important to folks in the independent music world. And there's been a lot of discussion and talk, but I think everyone's trying to figure out just what's going on. And now the probe into that merger has been paused due to, from what I understand, hey, EU people, holler at me if I got this wrong. There's some information that the investigators are waiting for from the companies involved, and until they get it, like they don't want the clock to run out, because I think there's a clock that can run out on these probes. Anyway, it's kind of, don't want to get too deep in the weeds, partly because I don't understand the weeds. I'm an American. But I think this is kind of interesting how these deals are getting into these strange, almost liminal space, right? It's wild. So that was
so I think you're kind of intrigued with how humans organize these kinds of ethical dilemmas and decisions, and to see in the United States where things are moving really quickly, there's no pause on anything. In fact, there's usually a fast forward button that's like, oh, we're going to skip the discussion part. We're going to skip the proceedings and just start deporting people, or just start bringing the military out, or whatever.
Yeah. Or suddenly to say like, okay, actually Chrome is fine. Google, you can keep it. It's definitely interesting to watch how different all of this, like business law and procedure, is in the EU versus the good old US of A. Speaking of the US of A, there was a really interesting little tidbit that Business Insider picked up on in I hate having to call it this, the big, beautiful bill. Whatever. The large piece of legislation that Trump and the Republicans passed not too long ago. And I'll just read the header because it's great. Influencers are among the winners of Trump's no tax on tips policy. So in the US, because many service people get a lot of their income from tips, that is actually a really nice way to give service workers more money, theoretically. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but it has its very positive sides. And it's interesting to think about like online tip jars. When you get tipped in a stream, podcasters, etc., will be able to not only not pay tax on those tips, but to take it out. Like, I think they can subtract it from their taxable income. So I don't know how that's going to shift things for certain musicians, artists, producers, content creators in the music space. But I thought that was an interesting thing to point out. Yeah.
I'm glad you pulled that one out. There was a couple months ago, there was also something about being able to debit expenses for recording as a business expense as well. So that combined together, they could be, if you do your taxes well and keep your books, they could be really beneficial to a variety of creators and musicians.
And hey, this is a terrible thing to say, but maybe we need to have a tax attorney on early next year on the Music Tectonics podcast.
That sounds fun. No, but actually, it's a really good idea. It's a really good idea.
So if you're a fun-loving tax attorney who knows a lot about entertainment stuff,
Yeah,
let us know.
come out to Music Tectonics this November. We could have a little session.
That's true. I'm sure there's going to be a fun tax attorney at Music Tectonics. Everybody's there.
I always want to be talking about increasing the value of music. And on the ledger, there's profit, there's the income side, and then there's the expense side. So if you can cut some expenses.
We like to talk about the money coming in, but the money coming out is also extremely important.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Hey, this was fun, Tristra. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we're back doing news roundups.
Hooray.
And yeah, if you want this type of news in your inbox, sign up for the Rock Paper Scanner. Tristra and I curate news all week long. You'll get about 20 or 30 articles like the ones we talk about here on the podcast. Tristra, we'll see you soon.
All right. See you soon, Dmitri.
Don't let future trends catch you by surprise. Mark Mulligan of Media Research kicks off Music Tectonics online pre-conference event September 17th, 2025. Mark's keynote will crystallize Media Research's deep industry data into the ideas you need to thrive in the next wave of change. Plus, 10 fresh startups will pitch for a spot in the final round of Swimming with Narwhals, and the jury of investors and experts will answer audience questions. Want to join us? Get your Music Tectonics conference badge now at musictectonics.com.
Now for our feature interview.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Music Tectonics. This is Tristra New Year Yeager, Chief Strategy Officer at Rock, Paper, Scissors, the PR agency focused on music innovation. Today, I get to have a lot of fun. I don't usually get to do these interviews, but I have a really wonderful scholar who's joining us today, and I think you're going to find this conversation exceedingly thought-provoking. So first, let me introduce him. I'm talking today with Dr. Christopher White, who is Associate Professor of Music Theory at UMass Amherst. Chris's research uses big data techniques to study how we hear and write music, which is the subject of his fairly recent book, The Music in the Data. That's from 2022. His articles have appeared in a multitude of academic journals, as well as in Slate, The Daily Beast, and the Chicago Tribune, among other places. Chris is also an avid organist. Like many people who listen to this podcast, he plays two roles as a musical creative person and deep thinker. Another fun fact, as a member of the Three Penny Chorus and Orchestra, he appeared on The Today Show on NBC and was a quarterfinalist on America's Got Talent. However, I brought him here today not to talk about those experiences, as exciting as they may be, but to discuss his most recent book, which is what really intrigued me and made me want to invite him on the podcast. The AI Music Problem, Why Machine Learning Conflicts with Musical Creativity, was published very recently by Routledge, just actually this June. The book probes, and this is a quote from the description, probes the challenges behind AI-generated music, enabling readers of all backgrounds to understand how contemporary AI models work and why music is often a mismatch for those processes. And we'll get into what we mean by a problem and where that mismatch lies, which actually might be a fun challenge for some of our music tech friends out there. So it's that purported gap that feels extremely important to explore right now, the gap between how music works and how AI works. So to explore this, we're zooming out a bit today and diving into how music and AI intertwine and interact, as well as into AI's potential impacts, positive, negative, and indifferent, on music creation and listening, the beating heart of all music tech. Chris, thank you so much for making time to join us today.
No, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure.
Oh, awesome. And just so you all know, we're in the middle of a heat wave, everybody here. So if we sound a little bit languid, it could be because of that. But before we dive into AI, I would love, Chris, and this is like really mean, this is like the meanest question to ask any academic. Can you give us a quick and dirty understanding of what exactly encompasses music theory? So what are we talking about when we talk about music theory?
No, I love that you said that it's a mean question, because you know who's the best person at answering this is the spouse of a music theorist. That my husband gives such a good rundown of what music theory is, way better than me. All right. So music theory is to musicians like English class is to a high school student, where you're learning like the inner workings and the stuff that's going on inside of music. So like in English class, you learn what makes up a sonnet and what the difference is between like an Italian sonnet versus a English sonnet, and what makes a Shakespearean sonnet. like particularly Shakespearean, and what's surprising and what is expected, what makes something funny. And so it's the same thing in music theory, where you might take a Wolfgang Mozart sonata and try to figure out what would have been expected in the 1790s versus what is innovative in the 1790s. When Mozart writes a phrase, what kinds of structures is he using? What kinds of chords is he using? Is this chord expected or is this chord not expected? And if you wanted to write that kind of chord, what notes would you put in that chord? And then the same thing in various different styles. Like a theorist of popular music would be talking about the same kinds of things in the Beatles. A theorist of Indian ragas would be telling you about what's going on in that style. So music theory, it's like getting into the building blocks and expectations and norms of each musical style.
And some of these things are explicit knowledge, right? Like musicians and composers or improvisers use them explicitly and are aware of them. And then some, right, are implicit. Like we can all feel when something modulates in a pop song from an English-speaking country. Often there is an emotional association that most people have, but they may not be aware of how that mechanism triggers their emotions. So do you explore both sides of that, or is it mostly the explicit side?
No, that's right. So they're sort of happening in parallel, because after you've listened to a bunch of music, you've internalized implicitly, as you say, a lot of these expectations. We know when you get that modulation at the end of a 2000s era pop tune, that the energy goes up. You know that feeling. And it's because you've listened to a lot of that. You get that because you've listened to a lot of that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You're really looking at the man in the mirror. You're doing it again. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when Beyonce in Love on Top does it like 4 times, you're like, oh my gosh, this is taking this norm and stacking it on top of each other.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is making the implicit explicit so that you can be thoughtful about it, so that you can name something, which as a performer, that's really important, that when you're playing a piece of music, you can name what's going on. You know exactly what's going on. And then there's also this explicit side where a lot of us didn't grow up listening to Mozart. And so if you want to be a thoughtful listener to somebody like Mozart, you have to study that from the outside in. And so you don't have, I didn't go into music school having a lot of implicit knowledge about Mozart phrases. That had to be taught to me. So we're doing both of these at the same time, giving outside knowledge in and then trying to bring internal knowledge out.
So how does music theory relate to AI? From what you were just saying, Chris, it feels like there's a lot of potential conversation between how we humans theorize music and how we might show a system how to parse musical expressions or musical structures.
Yeah. Anytime that somebody is taking a piece of music and slicing it up for a computer to learn components of it, to me, that's music theory, because you're saying what are the building blocks of this song that I can then give to a computer. And then conversely, anytime that a music theorist goes into a song and says, hey, what are the component parts of this? It feels to me like they're basically doing computer science, but without a computer, because you're taking each little chunk of it and you're basically like treating it like you're in a DAW, basic, right? Because you've got these little chunks that you're being like, that is located right there and it's called this thing. And so there's a very computational thinking underlying music theory. And I think there's a very music theory knowledge that underlies music computation.
That is so cool. So since these things are kind of harmonious, but you propose a really interesting question, somewhat provocative in the very title of your latest book, which is the AI music problem. So just for the listeners out there who don't hang around with scholars very much, a problem is not necessarily the same thing, I would say, as in everyday parlance, but I'll let you answer that. So when you say there's an AI music problem, what do you mean?
Okay, what I mean is that music is this big cloud of a bunch of different kinds of things and social practices and styles and ways that we use the same object very differently. And sometimes that works with AI and sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't map one to one. When AI tries to wrap its little mechanical hands around music, it only gets a little bit of it, and a lot of it falls through its fingers. And so we're talking about, what I'm trying to talk about in the book is parts of it that it can get and parts of it that are falling through its fingers.
And we'll talk about both of those parts. But so in some ways, when we say a problem, it's not that AI music is a problem, or that AI is a problem, or that music and AI are incompatible. It's just like there is a challenge, a question, a moment of tension. And I just want to explain that to our listeners, because when we in academia, when we talk about a problem, it's not necessarily like you and I have a problem, right? It's not like this sort of difficult impasse. It's more of a moment of tension, complexity, and need for more understanding.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, it's basically saying that it's not easy. And what about it is not easy?
You mentioned that there are some ways that AI and music play really well together. And so I was wondering if we could explore some of those. What areas of music do you feel lend themselves best to AI-powered analysis or emulation? And where might we see some real innovation? What aspects of the harmony between AI and music do you find most potentially fertile or exciting?
So you just talked about getting music into a probabilistic system, right? It could be, because what's underlying most contemporary AI is, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, like a probabilistic model that when you're at this point A, are you going to go to point B, C, D, or E? And now that you have like point A and C chunked together, what's after that? And you're doing this from a using probabilistic methods, not deterministic methods. And in a way, music is exactly that. Music composition is a probability game. If you're trying to write a melody like Amazing Grace, so let's say you're at ba 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 da ba 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 ba, knowing what happens next is a question of probabilities. Da 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 da. Those are all possibilities, and they're all similarly probable. And the reason that they work is because they're probable. Now, there's other things which are less probable. Ba 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 da ba 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 da. It also works, right? But it's less probable. And so, like, this idea of music being these strings of probabilities makes it really align very well with probabilistic systems. In fact, music in a lot of ways works better than text, because text can be wrong. In a lot of ways, text can be deterministic. If I say the cat is on the table, I didn't use the word table just because it often follows the cat is on the. It's probably because there's a cat on the table, right? And if there's not a cat on the table, that's wrong. So my sentence was determined by the cat being there, right? By the meaning that I'm trying to convey. There's no wrong answer in music. If I go ba ba da ba 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 ba, that's not wrong because it's less probable, right? And so there's no way if you just use probabilities, you're always going to get usable music.
That's
in a way that if you use just probabilities in text, you might be like those famous stories of lawyers using ChatGPT to write their law briefs, and then they cite a case that didn't exist. That ChatGPT does it because it's writing a probabilistic document. It's like, well, if I write a document like this, it's probably going to have a case like this in it. And then it's wrong because that case didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you write music like that, it's fine. It's still music. It still sounds good.
No judge is going to discipline you for a really quirky flat note after that lovely arpeggio that's all major.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so I think what technically works well is probabilistic. The other thing that I was thinking about is that music is always mediated by some sort of technology. And so the idea of adding more technology onto music makes a lot of intuitive sense to musicians. Of course, computers and digital music, that's one thing, but even the clarinet is a piece of technology, right? You're mediating your voice, your breath, using a piece of technology. And so the idea of adding more technology onto music, it's a very intuitive thing for a musician to just adopt more and more technology, which might not be the case for other
art forms.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So if I am a painter, right, and I start putting other layers of technology on my oil canvas, I may not be a painter anymore. I may be some other kind of visual artist, right? It can change the very definition of what you're doing based on the medium. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. And like poetry, how would you layer technology onto, it would become something different. Whereas layering technology onto music, you still have music.
Where do music and AI diverge? How can we talk in concrete terms about these areas where music and AI are not in sync?
Yeah, and this is what my book focuses on. And there's 5 areas that I focus on. I focus on the motivations behind making musical AIs, the data sets that we have to get, how we represent it to a computer, the structure of music that we are trying to find, and then how we interpret it. So, dear listeners, Tristra and I were at the same conference over the summer, and I heard her talk, and I wanted to introduce myself to her because you said something that like really resonated with me. And I don't remember what it exactly was responding to, but somebody was like, how do I use AI technology to make the next big thing, reach a wide audience or something like that? And your response was, well, don't make it about music or something like that. Because music is such a small fraction of the AI conversation. And it's because it's a small fraction of the commercial conversation. Music punches above its weight in terms of our cultural discussion, but I spend more on coffee than I do on music. And I suspect that's true of most people in the.
Yeah. That's why people are talking about super fans and things like that, but that's way off topic. Yeah. But you definitely have a point that there's.
Right. It's a smaller, the amount of money that goes into music AI research, it's dwarfed by almost every other.
Yeah.
And it's because music AI doesn't have a lot of revenue streams.
Yeah. Yeah. There's very few businesses that are like, for our hospital to function, we must have generative AI music.
That's right. Yeah. And then the next problem is that, so when you talk about, when Sam Altman comes out and talks about how he's going to make ChatGPT more powerful, it's often about increasing computing power, making more complex models or more responsive models, and bigger data sets. We need bigger data sets. We need like all language that everybody has ever created to make ChatGPT as good as it can be. And let's think about the number of people that create music compared to the number of people that create text and language. It's already a fraction. You and I create music, but how much music do we actually create in a day? It's also a fraction of the amount of text that we create in a day. And so how much musical data out there is a fraction of what visual and text data can rely on. Visual media have way more to rely on than musical data sets. And so we just have less data to work with. It's because fewer people in the world make music than make text and other things.
And you can imagine if we could have, say, this is in some weird, crazy alternate universe, if we could have recorded all of the folk performances around the world starting in like the 18th century, right? Or before, since it's completely made up, then we might actually have a body of data that rivals what you can be scraped in terms of text from the internet or photos from the internet.
100%. And then we'd still have the problem of actually getting the usable data out of those recordings, right? And that is no small feat either, because if you think about text, written text, it is like a black letter on a white page, and you could just pull that piece of information out and give it to a computer. Audio signals are so messy. It's really, really hard to extract reliable information from them. Even one rip of a bowstring is going to sound a little bit different than the next rip of a bowstring in the way that two T's on a page are going to look exactly the same, right? Musical data is so variable and so messy compared to other data too that it's really hard to make a good computational data set from it.
That's really interesting. And if you think too about everything from like room noise, you can have, of course, low contrast. For instance, when Google scanned all these books from libraries that were in the public domain, you sometimes see crazy artifacts and things like that from, just a yellowing paper and the text on there. But music, it's like infinitely more complex, right? Because you could have that bow, you could have the performance on a violin in a tiny closet, in a giant hall, on a street corner, and all of that would, to a human ear, we'd all detect, oh, that's the same sounding thing. But a computer is going to be like, what? It's going to have so much noise to clean up to get the signal. This is an interesting problem. So if we have these problems, what are some potential ways forward? How could we embrace more of music's aspects and still have it function within an AI system? Or are there some things we should just not attempt in your mind? What do you think?
One of the big mismatches, I think, is that music is primarily a social art form. And generative AI is going to be a non-social commodity. Right? But music and AI generated content are not totally unoverlapping in their uses, because there are certain like musical situations that tend to function like a commodity. What do we mean by commodity? We mean something that's bought and shared on the market that we don't care who made it. When you buy a trash can at Target, you don't care who made that. But when you go onto Spotify, you might be caring whether Taylor Swift's actually sang that song or whether it's a cover by somebody else. And so there's something uncommodity-like if you care about who made it. And if you care about who made something, it's really hard to swap out generative AI for that, right? And so that's an instance where they're not overlapping. However, a lot of people just turn on their Spotify to fall asleep at night, right? Generative AI seems fine with that, right? Seems like a great use for that. You can make infinite amount of music, and when I'm asleep, I don't care who's playing music to me, right? That seems like a good instance. Background of a podcast introduction music,
Totally.
right? Like that's the kind of functional music where we're not caring who made it, and we're not really paying too much attention to it. That feels like that would be a good use for generative AI. It's when we don't care about who is making it. We're not using music as a social object to connect to people.
I'm also curious to hear, as an educator and as someone who plays music regularly, how does AI strike you? And not just generative AI, because there's a lot of other types of AI that can be employed in musical creation or even in music listening coming up now. Since STEM separation, you can have people remixing their favorite tracks, that kind of thing. So I was curious if you had any thoughts about how untrained people, so folks who have never had a lesson or don't consider themselves musicians, how are you imagining AI and music with these interesting mismatches and harmonious moments? Will this change the game for people who had previously maybe not had access to a one-on-one musical education or sort of the traditional means of learning music?
That's a really good question. I bet a bunch of things will happen that nobody can predict.
Yeah.
But when I ask my music education grad students about this, they are extremely skeptical that AI will have much of a role in explicit music education. Because when a middle schooler takes clarinet, they're not taking clarinet to sound good. They're taking clarinet to right?
Truer words were never spoken.
Yeah. They're taking it because it's fun. It's fun to play. It's fun to do it with your friends. Maybe your mom is making you do it or something like that. But there's not a on-ramp that makes it easier to play the clarinet or quicker to play the clarinet with generative AI because it's such a physical, social thing. But I suspect that there can be uses in non-music education context. I think it would be cool, for instance, you're teaching Shakespearean sonnets in English class, and you have somebody write their own sonnet, and then you can use generative AI to set that sonnet to music.
Yeah.
That makes that assignment cooler and more interesting. And then you can talk about whether the generative AI set it properly to your expressive expectations, or whether it seems like a Shakespearean, like it's bringing out the same things that you would as analyzing your poem or something like that. There's ways I think that generative AI can be used, but it's probably not going to be used by amateurs to get into music. I mean, watch me be wrong about this, but
we'll have you back on in a couple of years.
Yeah.
See, Chris.
Right.
But I think this also is a wonderful challenge that someone who is interested in working with AI to create music tech could think about, well, how could that happen? Could there be an on-ramp? Maybe not for every instrument or every type of learning, but how I think you're raising a great point, which is fun. And social interaction, and also the embodied nature of music. That's why music and dance go hand in hand so often. And AI could have interesting roles in all of those, but we're going to have to figure those out and think about them pretty explicitly, right? So far it feels like we're only thinking about things in terms of the recorded music that's been so dominant maybe in most people's lives when it comes to their encounters with music in the last, 50 years. But the problem that you're bringing up is it's like a math problem, and some of the solutions could be really interesting and could push people closer to music who may not have had an entry point before.
Yeah, and I think music, because it poses such a difficult problem for computational analysis, we might also be seeing folks from the computer side be more interested in this going forward, in musical concepts going forward. My impression is on the AI side, there's a lot of focus on the audio signal, basically trying to treat chunks of audio as the thing that the computer's learning sequences of.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that then you get songs that sound very similar to other songs because you're just treating little bands of sound as the things that you're reordering. And so if you are training on the Doors, then something's going to basically sound like the Doors because it's using literal sound bands from the Doors. But if we're going to try to make that better, we're probably going to be like, what notes and what chords are inside of that?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's where really interesting conversations with music theory and with working musicians can come into play. And so musical knowledge can potentially have an active role in making these AI systems actually work better by being like, okay, what chord are we trying to have simulate right now? What notes are in this chord? And that sort of pushes the ball back into away from literal audio analysis into note analysis, which is more the domain of music theory.
Oh, that's interesting. So in some ways, we're talking about advancing some of these models into what is often called, and I say this with scare quotes, but the more reasoning models, right? Where it's not just like there's a, boom, 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 boom. I'm just lining up these probabilistic options, and more of like there is an overlying meta understanding of not just what is most likely to come next, but this is what a chord is, and this is how chords often come together. That is probably a pretty highfalutin concept for AI in its current state, but I think there's many folks who would love to see, I don't know, and maybe it's even multiple models working together. I know with a lot of the talk around agentic AI, there's this idea that you can create guardrails for your system so that it's not just throwing out totally wild hallucinatory stuff. Though in music, like you said, that would be awesome.
It would still be fine,
Music
right? Yeah.
hallucinations are fun.
Yeah. And I don't think it's impossible for AI systems to learn some of those larger structures. And I think some of what's going on in like a Suno or a UDO are learning. So there are aspects of those chords there, those harmonic principles there. I think it would be easier to learn, and you could learn more sophisticated things if instead of paying just attention to the audio signal, you also maybe tagged it or something like that with that this is what kind of chord it is. But anyway, this is sort of outside my area, but it seems like when we as humans talk about larger musical structures, we end up relying on these music theory concepts. So it seems like it could be a way for these models to learn larger musical structures if within those models there were these music theory concepts.
So it sounds like if you want to build a really amazingly nuanced model, you should have a chief music officer.
I think, yeah.
Theoretician. Amazing. So one more question before we wrap this up, and this has been so much fun. Thank you. I'm curious how this might change us as listeners, understanding more about how AI works, how music works. Do you feel like there's a potential for a change in the way we hear music or listen to music?
I think we're going to start worrying about whether something was created by AI or not. And I think that that's going to change. I think that's going to pop up in the back of our minds often. I think there were seeds of this when you would hear like a trombone sample and be like, I wonder whether that trombone sample was digital or acoustic, right? But it's a deeper question where you're like, am I listening to a flesh and blood human or am I listening to an AI?
Did I just cry because a bot wrote a song?
And that's the thing, that I think the first time that you feel an emotional connection to a bot and then you realize that it was a bot, I think you're going to feel cheated. And I think because you want to feel a connection to other human beings with when you're opting into a musical experience. And I think that if you feel that you're being fooled, then I think after that, you're going to really want to make sure that there's a human on the other side of that music production. And so I think one way that some listeners are really going to change in the next decade is that we're going to want an assurance that there was a human making this in
Mm.
order for us to bring our emotional vulnerabilities to
Yeah.
a song.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Or will we split into two groups? There's going to be folks who've fallen in love with their AI boyfriend, girlfriend, or the people who are like, I can create a parasocial relationship without knowing there is a human on the other end because I'm making it all up myself. It doesn't matter. And I think there are going to be people, for instance, if you're a fan of jazz, right? You're going to want to know that that solo kind of meant something, right? That the
Yeah.
person blowing really meant they were in that moment exploring the music and you're getting to witness that. Like that's kind of the whole point. So I'm sure it'll vary wildly, just like you mentioned before, genre wise. But yeah, how are people going to solve that equation for themselves, right?
The last time I said this in front of a group, somebody came up to me and was like, you know, I think that the younger generation already doesn't care about this. And
Yes and no. Yeah.
That's the thing. Yes and no. It's hard for me to imagine that if you are in an emotional state, you throw your headphones on, you want to listen to a sad song, you opt into listening to AI. That feels like that's not what that musical situation is for.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You want to feel like your emotions are part of a larger social community, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're absolutely right that some people will like just opt into that parasocial AI boyfriend thing and not care.
If it works for them, it's good.
The other side of this is that like in the 1880s, Edison comes out with his phonograph.
Mm-hmm.
Some of his funders are like, I just don't see this going anywhere because nobody's going to sit down and listen to music that they don't see being performed by another human, right? Like the phonograph is never going to not be just a simple novelty because nobody's going to emotionally connect with a machine. But this is the way that most people consume their music. And so there's probably going to be something like that too, where the things that you and I can't imagine right now, 100 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to be more the norm than the outlier.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a great example. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for your time and for your thoughts. And we'll make sure to put in the show notes how people can find out more about you and your work. I really appreciate the time, though.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We have new episodes for you every week. Did you know we do free monthly online events that you, our lovely podcast listeners, can join? Find out more at musictectonics.com. And while you're there, look for the latest about our annual conference and sign up for our newsletter to get updates. Everything we do explores the seismic shifts that shake up music and technology, the way the Earth's tectonic plates cause quakes and make mountains. Connect with Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. That's my favorite platform. Connect with me, Dmitri Vitsa, if you can spell it. We'll be back again next week, if not sooner.
You're listening to Music Tectonics.